Good morning, everyone. I'm actually going to stand up. My name is Cheylon Woods. I am the head and archivist of the Ernest Gaines Center, which is located at the University of Louisiana Lafayette on the third floor of the Edith Garland Dupree Library. First, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out today to listen to us talk and remember Dr. Ernest J. Gaines. Dr. Ernest J. Gaines is and was an internationally acclaimed author. His work is translated into more than 14 different languages. His work was used to explain and express U.S. slavery in France and has always and will forever have a global appeal. Dr. Gaines taught at the University of Louisiana Lafayette for more than 30 years and was the university's first creative writer in residence. During his tenure there, he impacted numerous students and community members and aspiring writers. The Ernest J. Gaines Center is dedicated to his memory and also preserving his legacy and the mission he had through his work, which is impacting and starting conversations about South Louisiana and rural South Louisiana Blackness. We do still work with students across the globe. Right now, predominantly, we're working with students in India who are doing their dissertations and master's thesis on Dr. Gaines's work. Dr. Gaines's work, specifically the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman, was the first ever neo-slave narrative to be made into a made-for-TV movie. And what that means is that novel has so much of an appeal, and it showed people, directors, important executive people, that people wanted to know the story of slavery from a Black perspective and not from the traditional plantation master narrative that had been shared at that point for centuries. It predated Roots by 7 years, and had it not had the popularity, Roots would have not been made into a made-for-TV movie. With a catalog of 10 novels, this one man who wrote about his very specific part of Louisiana, this very small part of Louisiana, Pointe Coupee Parish, Oscar, Louisiana, this ruralness impacted the entire globe and started conversations about humanity, understanding power structures, and culture. Dr. Gaines was an amazing person. Dr. Gaines was dedicated to his community and found a way to turn something that was so important to him into a lifelong career and passion. So today we're going to talk to Dr. Marcia Gaudet and Mrs. Dianne Gaines about the life and legacy of Ernest J. Gaines, about the impact of his work and who he was as a person, and things like the cemetery and the preservation of the memory of Sherry Quarters. At the end of our conversation, we will open the floor for questions and memory. And I hope you guys all enjoy and engage with us. That's why we're here. And if you haven't read Gaines's novels, or if you're interested in teaching Gaines's novels, please contact the Ernest J. Gaines Center. We do work with middle school and high school students as well as college students. And also, we just really love talking about Gaines's work, obviously. So please feel free to stop by if you're ever on campus. If you would like to schedule a tour, please feel free to email me or call me. My number and my email address are located on the website, and we can definitely work some things out. So I would like to turn it over to Marcia Gaudet. Oh, that was very loud.
That's literally starting with a bang. Thank you so much. And as Cheylon said, it's good to be here just to talk about and to remember so many of the contributions of Ernest Gaines to American literature, to world literature, and certainly what he brought to an understanding of Louisiana and Louisiana literature. There are so many things to say about him and the way that he influenced literature that it's hard to know where to start. But I think especially today where we're talking about the panel before us, about the African American past in Louisiana, that's a good place to start. Because one of his major contributions to American literature was what we call the quest for the past. That is, someone who went back and examined that past and gave us not only an authentic picture of that past, but one that in many ways conflicted with some of the narratives and the views that we had had by other writers. He was a major writer who used the first-person narrative to examine the painful realities of the past. As Cheylon pointed out, the equivalent of the ex-slave narratives. And it was a journey that he reimagined from before the Civil War, or during the Civil War, up through the Civil Rights era. So he really gives us that whole scope of history. And the other thing that Gaines is especially noted for in American literature is that he put such a focus on sense of place. That is, when you're reading his works, you get this image, this view of Louisiana and what it was like to live on a plantation in Louisiana. And the authenticity of his work comes from the fact that he had experienced that. Now, clearly he didn't experience from the time of the Civil War, but he had, in fact, talked to people. He had done the research. And so what he gives us, not all fiction manages to do that, but he gives us both a wonderfully imagined storytelling. He liked to call himself, he thought he was a storyteller first, that he could tell the story of the past. But he also gives us this authentic view of the place, of what the Louisiana was like, what the culture was like. Not always a past that we like to look back on, but one that's absolutely necessary to know about. And we had Ernest Gaines as a colleague for many years at UL Lafayette, but it's also important to know, what his reputation was, not only from the perspective of his colleagues or his family, but what his reputation was as a writer by international scholars or by international journalists. He was interviewed by major journalists and scholars, not only from throughout the United States, but in places around the world, from France, Germany, Japan, Egypt, just to name a few. Many of these came to Louisiana to meet Gaines and to see the place that he writes about. One of these, Hitoshi Namakata from Tokyo, Japan, a professor of American literature in Japan, said, and I'm quoting him, "I think that Mr. Gaines is one of the greatest authors of our time. I always wanted to go to Louisiana and see the world of the works of Mr. Gaines, and at last my dream came true." So for him, just coming here to see this place that's created so realistically in Gaines's work was like a dream of his lifetime. As you know, Ernest Gaines died 2.5 years ago, and the day of his death, in fact, just a few hours after it was announced, the New York Times published a beautiful tribute to him, lauding the genuineness of his writing and saying that he chronicled the lives and struggles of Black people in the South and gave us that realistic view not only of what it was like, but how they were able to deal with the situation of racism in the South and how they were able to not only survive, but to triumph. Charles Larson of the Chicago Tribune was absolutely correct when he said that a lesson before dying He described it as a majestic, moving novel that is an instant classic, a book that will be read and discussed and taught far beyond the rest of our lives. And of course, he was correct. The book won the National Book Critics Circle Award as the best book of fiction the year that it was published. It has also been part of the NEH Big Read series. Herman Beavers and John Lowe have called Gaines an American master. And Keith Clark, who is one of the scholars who has done one of the most recent books on Gaines criticism, said that Gaines is Louisiana's greatest contribution to American literature. He does recognize that maybe some fans of James Burke or other authors might take issue with that, but I think he's on solid ground that he made Louisiana, in producing Ernest Gaines, for whatever credit we can take, made a tremendous contribution to American literature. And as we go through Gaines's work, it's hard to just choose any one of his novels or short stories and say that this is the greatest. Mainly because not all scholars agree. That is, when you get into that category of things that we know will be taught, not only during our lifetimes, but after, it's hard to say one is absolutely the masterpiece. We all have our opinions. Gaines would never say. It was like, your children. You just don't come out and say which child is your favorite. And so it was the same with his works. But we will find with scholars that you do have that book that, for whatever reason, becomes one that you see as perhaps the greatest, his greatest masterpiece. We can start with Catherine Cormier, his very first novel. Here, a beautiful love story that, like many authors, was read much more after he wrote other novels. That is, people went back to read it after the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. And Miss Jane Pittman is certainly, both because of the novel and because of the movie that was made, the memorable scenes in the movie, one that became so much a part of American literature. It was actually the first time that we saw that first-person narrative about someone who was an ex-slave and then brought it up to the civil rights movement. His other works, and we can't skip over his short stories, because for many of us who first came to read Ernest Gaines, we were introduced to his works through his short stories. That is, The Sky is Gray, which is still one that is anthologized in so many books for schools and for universities. A Long Day in November, Just Like a Tree. All of these are very much part of the American literary canon. His next book, A Long Day in November, that was a children's book, A Long Day in November. Then the next novel, In My Father's House. It was the book that he said was the hardest to write. His only book that's not in first-person narrative, but also the one that he felt he had to write before he could write anything else. Then, A Gathering of Old Men. And as you've read A Gathering of Old Men, you know that even though Gaines deals with serious things, He is also known for his wonderful ability to point out that sometimes things are so absurd that the only way to handle them is to laugh. That is, the humor in this book, as we so often find in his books. And then I have to admit, I can say that if I had to pick my favorite, or the one that I would say was a masterpiece, it would be A Lesson Before Dying. Not everyone agrees, but certainly that is a masterpiece, and one that if you haven't read it, give yourself a treat and read A Lesson Before Dying. Then, of course, Gaines has published 10 books. The next was a collection of stories and essays, Mozart and Leadbelly. Finally, The Tragedy of Brady Sims. A short book, his shortest novel, sometimes called a novella. But again, one that made a big impact. And just this month, an article written in a national journal about the tragedy of Brady Sims and comparing it with Toni Morrison's Beloved, that in both a parent murders a child because they wanted to protect that child from a fate that they considered worse than death. And so again, that was his last novel, and again, one that we're just beginning to see all the possibilities for enlightening us, entertaining us, informing us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gaudet. You mentioned Catherine Cormier, and looking out the audience, I think something is really interesting and important to point out. Dr. Gaines started writing Catherine Cormier when he was 16 years old. At 16 years old, when he moved to California, he was able to go to a library for the first time. That is something now that is kind of hard to think about, not having access, being denied, not being allowed to go into a library. And in that library, the first thing he did is he looked for Southern literature because he wanted to be reminded of his home. He did not see a true representation of people like him in that literature. So at 16 years old, he decided he would change that narrative and write people like him as he remembered them, specifically Sherry Quarters, Oscar, Louisiana, Point Coupee Parish. And he did. He used that motivation as a teenager, as a high school student, to change, to create a counter narrative literally in global literature. He used what he knew, what he loved, what was close to his heart, which was his home, in very rural Louisiana, growing up on a sharecropping plantation, the same plantation where his family had been enslaved. He used that as a muse, and he impacted the world. So it doesn't really matter where you come from. It doesn't matter what cards you are dealt. It matters what you do with that. Because with that, he is still being discussed today. Four of his 3 novels and 1 short story were all made into made-for-TV movies. And it was really important. I don't know how else to say it. It was really important. We talk about Toni Morrison, you talk about Maya Angelou, you talk about James Baldwin. They were his contemporaries. He wrote with them, like literally. There were writing groups they had together where they were practicing their craft together. And the difference is he chose to only talk about rural South Louisiana. He didn't move his characters to New York or California or Chicago or Detroit. He stayed in rural Louisiana because that mattered to him. And it worked. It worked. It created this lens of humanity that was applied, that had not normally been applied specifically to rural Black communities or rural Southern communities. and created a conversation that was discussed about in Russia, in Africa, used to teach students in France. Excerpts from the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman was used in French textbooks. He was asked to go to France to help them create a creative writing program for a university system. France. France is something we think about high culture, right? Fancy people know all these things, have impacted the world, and they didn't have a creative writing program. They called this man from rural Louisiana to go create a creative writing program for them. That's really impressive. That's actually pretty improbable when you think about it, right? This tiny, very segregated place created this amazing person. And he used his gift to uplift those communities, to share their stories, not being downtrodden, not being beat up, but of being human. He gave them the space to be human, and he wrote that, and it resonated. People thought Jane Pittman was a real person. I have letters where people asked him, what happened to Jane? When did she die? Did you know her? No, because she's fiction. She didn't exist, but she felt so real, right? When people read his novels, they can identify people who it reminds them of, because he's writing about communities very much so like the communities of early Iberia Parish, before it was Iberia Parish. He's writing about these quarter communities, these spaces that honestly, in one way or another, each and every one of us is connected to. If you are generationally from rural South Louisiana, small South Louisiana, rural South Louisiana, however you choose to say it, you're connected to a quarter community. I'm not from rural South Louisiana. I am from California, but my father is from Arkansas, and my father was a sharecropper. So even though he's not talking about Arkansas, he's talking about the kind of communities my dad grew up in. So I'm connected to this narrative as well. And there's something deeply humane about this narrative. What it is exactly, I don't know. That's my job, to help people find that out and listen to their stories when they come and talk to me at the Gaines Center and say, this is what I think is cool. And I tell them, okay, that is cool. Keep writing about that. But there's something there, which means there's something for everyone to grasp from it. Yeah, does that make sense? Okay. So we're going to talk about Dr. Gaines as the man and as the community member, and like what was important to him about this space that he had dedicated his entire life to preserving. We're going to hear from Mrs. Dianne Sauleny Gaines, who is in her own right a very accomplished woman. She created an amazing organization in Florida where she was a lawyer, and she actively helped Dr. Gaines do this very important work throughout the time of their marriage. So, Mrs. Dianne Sauleny Gaines.
That was quite something, and here I am. I'm not a scholar. A lawyer, yes, but not a scholar. But I love to read, and that's how I met Ernest. I grew up in New Orleans, but I left as soon as I was able to at 21 and went to Miami because I thought that's where I would find some freedom. I couldn't go to the library in New Orleans when I was in high school or college either. There was none here for Ernest. I had schools in New Orleans. But when I go back, I'm constantly reminded of the places that I couldn't go to when I lived there. And sometimes I think I have post-traumatic stress syndrome because it still hurts. But I'm going to tell you, I'll start out with how I met Ernest, because everybody asks me, well, how did you meet Ernest? I was in my 40s, he was in his 50s. To give you an idea, when he introduced me to his mother, she said, "Thank God." I love to read, and one of his favorite sayings was, read, 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 write, write, write. That's what he told his students all the time. Well, I grew up reading. My sister had gone to California and sent me books constantly. And we had a library in New Orleans that I could go to. It just wasn't the main library. But in that library, there were few to no books that were by or about Black people. And I was an English major when I was at Xavier. That's an HBCU, you know? But I really didn't start reading literature by African Americans until probably the 60s. I know that seems very long ago to some of you, and I see your young faces, but I'm not that old, you know? And I read all the time. Well, it turned out that in the 60s, there was a lot of angry writing by Black authors. But when I discovered, there were two people I always said were my favorites. Toni Morrison was my favorite, and I'm not going to preface it with saying African American. She was my favorite female writer. And Ernest Gaines was my favorite male author. I had only read two books of his. The autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman and A Gathering of Old Men. My children were, by that time, either in college or had graduated. Stephen, my youngest, was at Hampton University and had told me that he was going to be reading Gathering of Old Men. So Ernest, I volunteered a lot. And Miami had a magnificent international book festival, which it still has. It's even bigger now. The year before I met Ernest, I met Toni Morrison. But this time, I met Ernest. He was on a panel of 4 African American men who were going to talk about fathers and sons. And I went to hear the panel. And of course, they were signing books afterwards. This was in Miami, where I was living. They were signing books, and I went up to get a book signed for my son, who was going to be reading Gathering of Old Men. So I stood in line, and I waited for Ernest to get to me so he would sign. And I told him that my son was at Hampton University, and he was going to be reading A Gathering of Old Men. To which Ernest said, "Oh, you know," he looked up at me, he said, "I'm going to be going to Hampton next semester. I'll be speaking there on Gathering of Old Men and other works." So he autographed the book to Stephen, "I met your mom, looking forward to seeing you," etc. That was the initial introduction that we had. That evening, this sounds long, huh? I like telling the story. That evening, a girlfriend and I were invited to a reception because we had volunteered at the book festival. And as we walked through the hotel lobby, Ernest and one of the other men who were on the panel were sitting down at the bar, and we stopped to say hello and to say, "Well, where is the reception?" To which Ernest said, "You don't want to go to that. There's nothing going on there. Nobody's there. It's the dullest thing." Then he looks at us and he says, "Is there some place we can go to listen to some jazz?" So my girlfriend and I looked at each other and we figured, well, we know these guys. They're not like strangers and they're new in the city. There was one jazz club we knew of, and without speaking, you know how you talk with your eyes? Without speaking, we decided we would invite them to go to this one jazz club that we knew of, and we took them. Well, Ernest happened to sit in the front seat. I was driving. So the whole rest of the night, he and I talked about what? Louisiana and gumbo and all the things that each of us loved and missed about Louisiana, and some of the things that we didn't love and miss. He asked me if I had read Catherine Cormier, and I said, well, no, I had only read Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman and Gathering of Old Men. So he said, well, I'll send it to you. And sure enough, after he got back to San Francisco, he sent me a copy of Catherine Cormier, which turned out for my daughters and me to be one of our favorites because it's a love story and it's a story about women. And I neglected to say that one of the things I loved that made him my favorite was his treatment of women. His treatment of women was so different than many other books I had read. He treated women with respect and with love and with dignity. And that never changed. So we began to correspond. That was 1988. I know some of you weren't born, but that's okay. 1988. It was 2 years later before I saw him again, during which time he sent me books and we talked on the phone. He invited me to San Francisco, to which I said, no, I'm not going to San Francisco. But when my daughter and I were driving back from Notre Dame, where she had received a master's degree, we stopped in New Orleans to visit my mother. And he was going to a wedding in New Orleans. If you knew Ernest, you knew he wouldn't cross the street to go to somebody's wedding. But he was flying all the way from San Francisco to go to somebody's wedding in New Orleans and asked me to go with him, to which I initially said, no, I'm not going to any wedding. So my daughter said, oh, Mom, we're going to be in New Orleans. Go with him to the wedding. She talked me into it. So then I agreed I would go to the wedding, which we did. And I had told I was staying at my mother's house, and I had told her and my sister, you know, New Orleans and Louisiana are full of your relatives. You're always with your relatives. I had told them about Ernest. They said, well, bring him over for dinner. I said, oh, no, I don't think I'm going to do that. Sure, bring him over for dinner. No. So I told him that my sister invited us to dinner. I said, but I told her no. He said, oh, sure, we can do that. So then I was caught. And when we went to my sister's house, I thought it was just going to be her and her husband. My mother was there too. They immediately fell in love with him the way everybody did, I found out later. But that dinner was culminated with an hour-long movie of my sister's daughter's wedding. Do you know what it's like to sit through somebody's wedding that you don't know? I was crying. I don't think they're doing this to me, but they did. Then I took him to Café du Monde, and he had on a navy blue jacket. And every time he tried to talk with a beignet in his hand, the powdered sugar would fly all over the place. Anyhow, that's how I met Ernest. That was 2 years after I first met him, which always tickled me because I told him he had to go to San Francisco and clean up his act before he came back to meet me. One of the things that he was stressed out about was the cemetery in which his aunt, Augustine Jefferson, whom I never met, she was long dead when I met Ernest. She was buried there without a headstone because at the time they had no funds to install a headstone. And other members of his family, but also friends, extended family, were buried in that cemetery. And if you ever get a chance to go, you will see that it is surrounded by sugarcane. He had nightmares, he told me, that the sugarcane would take over the cemetery, that it would be plowed under, as we had read happened to other places, and that it would just be no memory of the people who had lived such lives there. So we weren't married yet, but I was practicing law, and I had a daughter who was a lawyer as well. We immediately started doing research on cemeteries in Louisiana, got an attorney, and were able to we established a nonprofit cemetery corporation and got the owners. You know, I always have to deviate a little bit, but the property always stayed in the ownership of members of the family. So there were 16 owners of that 1 acre little piece of property. Perfect timing. That's me. I'm sorry about that, lady. There were 16 members of the extended family who owned parts of that cemetery, and they all deeded their ownership rights to the cemetery corporation. But before that happened, we had started cutting it. We had gotten people involved, and we started keeping it cut because it had been overgrown. There were weeds and all kinds of things in the cemetery. But for a number of years now, it has been lovingly taken care of. And once a year, right before All Saints' Day, on the Saturday before All Saints' Day, except for COVID, we didn't do it then, we have what we call a Cemetery Beautification Day. And we invite people who have any connection with the cemetery. Many students from UL and LSU come, and we clean and paint the vaults, that's what they're called, and we plant flowers, and then we have and we talk a lot. We talk a lot, and we mingle, and then we eat. Of course you have to eat if you're in Louisiana, right? So we have a dinner at our house, and everybody stays until dusk from early morning. But Ernest always said he wanted to be buried there. And in fact, I didn't think that was me, but it must be. He wrote what he wanted to be on his headstone. and that was to lie with those who have no mark, because so many of the people could not read and write, and he grew up reading letters for them and writing letters for them. So that is what is on his headstone. My daughter Maria, who encouraged me to meet him to go to the wedding, is buried next to him. Is that this? She didn't die from COVID, but she died less than a year after Ernest. And they loved each other dearly. In fact, he loved all my children. She wanted to be cremated, and she's buried right next to him. They're together. One of the things, I had lots of notes, but there was an event at Penn Faulkner in which they asked writers to write something about a word that they gave, that they presented, and it was obsession. And Ernest wrote that his obsession had been the cemetery. He wrote a very beautiful piece that was about the cemetery, but it no longer, well, it's my obsession now because we still very much take care of it, and it's part of what we do. One of the things I wanted to share with you is that to know him was, in fact, to love him. I know that comes from a song, but recently, I didn't think about that until recently, because first, I met a young man whose father had a blues club in Baton Rouge. He has a new book out. His name is Chris Thomas King. His father had a blues box in Baton Rouge. Ernest used to go there when he would visit, which he did often. I listened to NPR a lot, and that there was going to be a presentation at a museum in Port Allen. So I went, and afterwards I wanted to get a book signed. As usual, I love books. That's my weakness. And I asked the young man, did he know Ernest? And oh my goodness, he jumped up, came around the table, gave me a big hug, told me how much Ernest meant to him, and that he had been an inspiration. That was one of all of this in 1 week. Then Xavier University had a presentation of a film, the first one, by Jason Berry. Oh, I think he's going to be here this weekend. So after the presentation and after going to get my book signed, I reminded Jason Berry that he had been to our house, that I was Dianne Gaines. Oh my goodness, I got another big hug and a long story of how much Ernest meant to him. And then yesterday, I picked up from the post office a note from someone whom I don't know. I'm going to read you a little piece of it. She wants to come and see the cemetery. She was an undergrad at UL. She thought she would ask me if she could come sometime and visit his grave. I'd really like to bring him some flowers. He was a huge influence on my writing. I'd simply like to tell him thank you and pray with him for a while, but I don't want to intrude on your privacy. To know him really was to love him. Before I met Ernest, I never knew anybody like him. And so that's my short story. of my life with Ernest Gaines.
So, as Mrs. Gaines said, the cemetery was, as Dr. Gaines said, an obsession of his. What's important to understand about the cemetery that he and Mrs. Gaines worked so lovingly to preserve is that was the only cemetery for Black people to be buried on that plantation from the point of slavery forward. It is about an acre. It is 1 acre. How many of you know how big an acre of land is? Okay. So, like, if you think about subdivisions, you know, everybody's familiar with a subdivision, right? Like most 3-bedroom, 2-bath houses are on 1/4 of an acre. So you think about putting 4 3-bedroom, 2-bath houses together. That includes front and backyard. When you think about an acre, does that seem like enough space for everyone who died on that plantation to be buried? No. This is why that is something that was so important and is so important. There are people whose graves were plowed under because headstones are expensive. How do you know you're in a cemetery? If you're just walking through the woods, how would you know you walked into a graveyard? Headstones. What if there are no headstones? People use things, natural things, bushes, trees, flowers, rocks, things that deteriorate, wooden crosses, things that could be moved, literally like flat stones that could be moved or repurposed as necessary, as someone decides is necessary, I guess, to mark those graves. But the thing is, when the community leaves, when those people leave or die, there is no one there to tell them what those spaces are. So, when Dr. Gaines became able, the space that never left his mind, the space that was an obsession to make sure his family, his friends, his community, past and present and future, would not be forgotten, they worked to save the cemetery, what was left of it. People are still being buried in that cemetery today. Dr. Gaines is buried there. He has brothers buried there, his aunt's buried there, his best friend was buried there last year, Mr. Bibbins? Was it last year? Or 2 years ago now?
Just last year.
Last year. So even though everyone who impacted that landscape is not in that space, they are not forgotten. Because Dr. Gaines made sure they would never be forgotten through his novels, and through his work to preserve that space, and even preserving the church that his family built for the community on the quarters. They worked to preserve the church, and it was moved to their backyard where community members and students, high school, middle school, college, whomever wanted to come and see the space, to see the church, to walk into the church, to experience that, was always welcome to come. The cemetery cleaning, which is a very big deal, specifically when Dr. Gaines was alive, sitting around listening to people tell stories, remembering what it was like to be on that space, remembering what their parents told them or what their grandparents told them, was something powerful. It is important to understand the memories that were shared and the memories Dr. Gaines engaged with and experienced. Tenancy and sharecropping lasted until the 1970s. People lived in Sherry quarters until 1996 when the last person moved. These were spaces that were 2-room buildings. 2 rooms. So how many of you guys have siblings? How many of you guys would love to share a room with your mom, your siblings, maybe your grandmother, aunt, cousins? Right? Doesn't sound fun, right? But that's what people did. In the Ernest J. Gaines Center, we have a frame of scrib. Scrib is a currency. It is not a currency that is recognized by any government, but recognized by a person or a landscape, i.e. plantation scrib. We have a frame of scrib that says River Lake Plantation on it with monetary values under it. People remembered being paid that way. What do you think that means? If your mom or your dad or your caretaker, your adult, however that might look, whatever that might be, came home and told you that their supervisor now said, well, we don't like the way American money looks, so we're not going to use it anymore. So I am going to pay you in like construction paper stars. I'll tell you how much the stars are worth. It doesn't matter. It's okay. It's okay. I'm going to pay you in construction paper stars. And I know that sounds crazy, but I got it. I'm going to build a place for you to live, and I'm going to build a store for you to spend those construction paper stars. What does that mean? You're stuck. You are stuck. You cannot save money. You do not have a currency that anyone else will accept, because if I'm not your employer, why do I care about your construction paper stars? Right? So this is a system that was in place. This is a system that impacted people, Louisianan people, from the 1870s until the 1970s. This is something that has impacted the way we understand and view the world every single day. We still are processing through that system that was created today. Even though we don't see it, even though we do not live in the quarters, we move through the quarters every single day. Whether you realize it or not, the way we understand labor, the way we understand compensation is shaped by Tennessee sharecropping and the system that was in place for so very long. So these novels that Dr. Gaines wrote that never extended past the 1970s, and what I mean is he did not write novels that took place after the 1970s, still have value today. We still learn from them today. And this is because Dr. Gaines decided at a very early age that he was going to make sure this space was represented as accurately as he felt that he could, and he did that. And somebody from rural Louisiana has had this impact. Somebody, unfortunately, we don't learn about in Louisiana, but we can. You are all always invited to the Ernest Gaines Center. You are all always invited to contact me, to schedule appointments with me, to invite me to your classrooms, both physically and virtually, to talk about Gaines's work. That's what I do. That's what I enjoy. Obviously, that's why I have the position I have. Because there's still value in this, and there will forever, if I can have any say over it, have value in it. So, now I'd like to open the floor up for questions, comments, fun memories. Okay, we have a couple. Can we get a mic for, yeah, they're recording. Can we get a mic for the audience members?
Good morning, and thank you very much for your information. We are from Texas, and in the great state of Texas, the governor and the legislature are in the process of banning books. I don't remember how many, but I'm sure Dr. Gaines' books are on the list, as is Toni Morrison. Does Louisiana have anything about banned books? Not, okay.
Well, unfortunately, we're dealing with the same thing in Lafayette, not very far from here, which is the largest city in the southwest Acadiana area. And in fact, although as far as I know, they've not had any of Ernest Gaines' books banned, but we do have members of the library board who are voted and in fact banned books. So.
Well, one other thing is, like I said, there are a number of issues, but I think the greatest tragedy is they are banning all information, all history of racism. Now, I don't know how they're going to teach history without teaching that. So I really appreciate y'all having something like this.
I had forgotten about Lafayette, and I live there. I want to say two things. Those of you who are students, talk your teachers into getting you a field trip to the Gaines Center. It's truly, truly, truly worthwhile. If you end up there as a student at UL, make sure you go to the Gaines Center. This is an international author who has his center 30 miles from where you're living. So that's my first thing. Secondly, the connection between the cemetery that obsessed Ernest Gaines and the stories he told are one and the same. If any or all one of you would comment on those letters that he wrote and how that contributed to voice in his works. Does that make sense?
Yes, and again, he has said that, those early letters were the first indication of, he used the expression, the sound of my people talking. And that is, when he wrote those letters, he was both trying for the person who would read them, for them to hear that relative or whoever, the friend they were writing about. And again, one of the things that he is considered a master at is writing the kind of dialect, one that's both readable and that's not patronizing or marginalizing. That's a very difficult thing to do. That is, to make it sound like the people who are speaking those words would sound, without putting in words that would be judgmental. Remember, to the people you're talking to in your own community, nobody has an accent. That is, this is what we sound like. It's only when we leave that community that people start talking about, whether it's wherever you're from, South Louisiana. But he had that ability to make his work both very readable and I think the wonderful, really, Darrell Bork, who was a former poet laureate and a good friend of Ernest Gaines at UL, said that Jefferson's journal in A Lesson Before Dying was really the work of a poet. That is, it's so beautifully written, no punctuation, and yet it reads as you could imagine this person who had very little education, very little ability to write, would have written or spoken. And that ability to be able to put into writing how a group of people would sound is just a remarkable, incredible talent, and something that Gaines was recognized for.
I just wanted a question about how do you feel? Why do you think people in these other states as such are deciding to ban these very informational books for us as high school students?
Well, I feel like it's an issue of control. I feel like reading helps you build critical thinking skills and helps you and teaches you in a good way to question things. That's one of the things, you question everything around you. You ask, when someone tells you something, always ask, why are they telling me this? What do they gain from telling me this? If it's gonna upset me, why do they always tell me things to upset me? Everything happens for a reason. But there's a level of control that is trying to be exercised, because the conversations that should happen, that will still impact us today, that have impacted us pretty much time immemorial, are difficult conversations. These are conversations people do not have answers to. And there's nothing wrong with not having an answer. Sometimes there's not a solid and concrete answer. The answer is pretty viscous. It's going to continue to move and flow and change as time changes. But we're not ready to have those conversations, or we don't think or somebody doesn't think we're ready to have those conversations. Because one thing I will say about high school students now, y'all are ready to have a lot of conversations. Y'all want to have a lot of conversations. And for a lot of people, that's scary. You guys have access to so much information all the time, from Instagram and TikTok and YouTubes and Twitter feeds and who knows what else, because I do not like social media, so I don't know all of them, and that is fine. Please don't tell me. I don't want to know. You guys are constantly engaging with the world. Not just your community, literally the world. The internet makes it possible for you to engage and question things that are happening hundreds of thousands of miles away. And a lot of you do, all the time. You are questioning the systems that, for a lot of us, we didn't have access to enough information to know to question. So it's easier to control by removing things that will make you question to protect you. I say protect in quotations because I disagree. But that's also just my personal opinion. That's why I think book banning is happening. I think it's an issue of control. I think part of it is manipulation and part of it is fear. I think there are people banning books who genuinely think they're doing the right things, and there are people banning books because they genuinely do not want you to question.
But you know, banning books is not anything new. I mean, historically, books have always been banned in repressive societies. And frankly, the repression today is racism. You know, it just is.
You have another question? And then young lady, second row back. Okay.
Also another question. How do you think this censorship will affect future education?
It's going to have a detrimental effect. So, students today are not being taught critical thinking skills, and then they go into college where we expect you to critically think. And it is not only going to have an impact on you as a future workforce, but I am seeing it having an impact on your mental health now, because there are so many meltdowns that are happening freshman year because you thought you were smart and all of a sudden you feel like every professor is telling you you're dumb and you don't know anything, and that's not what's happening. When you walk into a college campus as a freshman, as a student, no one is asking you, I guess except for math and science, humanities, I don't know math and science, no one is asking you to regurgitate. We are asking you to synthesize. We are asking you to think about what you have read, why that person wrote that, and what does it mean to you, and how do you reflect that from a scholarly perspective. That's what being well-sourced means. If you come in after 12 years of never being allowed to do that, how are you expected to do that? But the thing is this: colleges, professors, librarians, all of us, we don't have the space and you don't have the time, because you still need to get out in 4 years, right? To teach you how to rethink. We don't. And a semester is not very long. And it's scary, but you can do it. And the great thing is they might not let you read it in school, but you got a library. You can read it on your own. You can engage on your own, and you can, well, not in library books, please don't write in library books. But if you buy books, you can annotate those books and write your notes and your thoughts in those books along with the things that you are reading while you're reading, because guess what? That's what you have to do in college. When you cite something, you have to say, oh, I like this part, and this is what I thought about it, and then write a paper about that. It is going to have a detrimental effect. It is going to carry through, because we hear things about the workforce not knowing how to do this or that, or thinking through things. Well, if you've never been taught to do anything but regurgitate or push a button, then how exactly are you expected to all of a sudden one day know how to think critically and assess a situation and make a snap decision? That's just my opinion.
My question was for Mrs. Dianne Gaines. Earlier on, you had spoke about leaving New Orleans to go to Miami because you were looking for more freedom. When you had left to go to Miami, did you ever find your freedom, or are you even now to the day with everything going on, are you still looking for it? Because I know a lot of us here may be looking for that same freedom and think that if we leave, oh, we're gonna get it. But I just want to know, if we leave, is there a chance we'll ever find it?
I've been told by my friends who still live in Miami that it's changed significantly. I left when I married Ernest, and we came to Lafayette and all of that. I was much older. But when I was 21, when I had grown up in New Orleans, I couldn't go or do much of anything. I couldn't go to City Park. I couldn't go to the main library. I was dying. I was smart, and I thought that Louisiana did not want me. I went to Miami, and certainly that was still in the South, but that was because everybody else was going to the West Coast, north, somewhere, and I never followed the crowd. So I went the opposite direction, but Miami was different. It had a governor that was a very progressive governor at the time, and I was not going to be living in North Florida or Central Florida. South Florida, I thought was different. Was it different? In some ways, yes. It gave me the opportunity to go to law school, which I didn't think, and I may have been wrong, that I would not have had when I lived here. But in fact, I had an assignment when I was 14, and the Brown decision came out, and I wanted to interview a black lawyer, and there was only one that I was aware of after research. So being a lawyer, which was something I always wanted to do, was not going to be something that I thought I could do when I was here. And I didn't really expect to do it in Miami, but I grew, and I was given the opportunity. I went to University of Miami Law School. We only had 7 black students in law school at the time. So no, it's just that I didn't have constant reminders of what I could not do when I went to Miami. I still have them when I go to New Orleans now, My grandchildren take me to City Park, and I can't help but remembering I couldn't go to City Park. I mean, it seems totally unreal today, but believe me, it's real. I still feel it.
Good morning. I don't have a question. I want to make a comment. I currently serve as the mayor of a small community next door, which is called Generette. And Mrs. Gaines, I just want to share with you, several years ago, I had the privilege of meeting Mr. Gaines through a mutual friend, Mr. David Crashan. And David's oldest son, or well, that one and only, I think, Michael, was a good close friend of my oldest son. And it was very, very engaging. I'm an alumnus of USL, as it was called back then. You talk about the cemetery. I grew up right smack in the middle of a cemetery. And where I live today, even reside on both sides, have the cemetery and surrounding our property. And as I tell a lot of folks, the best neighbors in the world. They don't bother you for anything. And when I was growing up, if my ball went over across the fence into their area, they wouldn't complain about it. I could jump over and go and get it. And there's always the little scary part where folks will try to tell you, be afraid of dead people. Well, it's not the dead we have to be afraid of, it's the living. However, what Mr. Gaines has expressed with the cemetery, I had an experience several years ago doing some traveling in St. Mary Parish near the late Governor Foster's residence, which is called Oak Lawn Plantation. And at this time, the sugarcane had been cut down. And out in the distance, I could see a cemetery. And being the curious person that I am, I said, let me go and check that out. So I drove back through there on the headland, and it was so fascinating, a cemetery with headstones that went back into the Civil War. And I know this was black folks that were buried there, interned there, and some possibly were slaves of the Fosters. They were, very wealthy family involved in sugarcane and those industries, or even sharecroppers. But what even intrigued me more was that the stories, as you look at the headstones, that you imagine and wonder what they told, what those stories are. And it also engaged me to think of this, all of us, we are the library for each other. And we do know that by sharing, yes, there's the internet and there's Google, but as you were saying with the critical thinking, there's nothing like when someone can sit down and talk to you and share with you information and challenge your thinking. So I'm grateful for the era that I came through. I'm also grateful for the fact that we can be the library for our young people. We can't let the internet raise our children. We can't let the internet and those, it's good, it's information, and I still would challenge it also, but the critical thinking side of things, that's what makes us people. It's not the artificial intelligence and all of that. But anyhow, I just wanted to share with you basically that he had a great impact on me, imprint, left an indelible mark, and you're certainly to be saluted. Thank you very much.